May 8, 1945, Wilhelmshaven, northern Germany, 1,730 hours. The boy was maybe 14. Maybe younger. Hard to tell through the dirt and the hollow cheeks and the way his knees buckled when he tried to stand straight. He wasn't in uniform, just a threadbare wool coat 2 sizes too big and boots held together with wire. He'd been standing outside the Canadian field kitchen for 20 minutes, silent, watching the smoke rise from the chimneys, watching soldiers move in and out with tin cups and ration tins. His hands were shaking. Not from cold. From hunger. The cook saw him first. Corporal named Davies, from Manitoba, who'd been slinging hash since Normandy. He stepped out into the fading light, wiping his hands on his apron, and the boy flinched. Stepped back. Raised his hands like he expected a rifle butt or worse. Davies stopped. Held up one hand, palm out. Universal language. Wait. The boy didn't run. Didn't speak. Just stood there, swaying slightly, eyes locked on the door behind Davies where the smell of boiled potatoes and reconstituted beef was pouring out into the rubble-strewn street. Davies turned, walked back inside. Came out 30 seconds later with a mess tin. Steam rising. He held it out. The boy stared at it. Then at Davies. Then back at the tin. "I haven't eaten in days," he said in broken English. Voice barely above a whisper. Davies nodded. Kept holding the tin out. "Then you'd better start." The boy took it. Hands shaking so hard the soup sloshed over the edge. He brought it to his lips and drank without stopping, without breathing, until it was gone. Then he stood there holding the empty tin like he didn't know what to do next. Davies took it back. Went inside. Came out with another. They didn't speak. The boy ate. Davies watched. When the second tin was empty, Davies gestured to a crate by the wall. The boy sat. Davies went back inside and returned with a blanket and a bar of chocolate, Canadian issue, wrapped in wax paper with the maple leaf stamped on the side. The boy looked at it like it was a grenade. "It's food," Davies said. "Not a trick." The boy took it, unwrapped it slowly, ate half and put the rest in his coat pocket. Then he started crying. Not sobbing. Just silent tears running through the dirt on his face. Davies sat down on another crate. Lit a cigarette. Didn't offer one, kid was too young. Just sat there while the boy cried himself out. When it was over, the boy looked up. "Why?" he asked. Davies took a drag. Exhaled slowly. "Because you're hungry." That was it. No speeches. No politics. No grand moral statements. Just a cook from Manitoba and a starving German kid and a tin of soup in the wreckage of the Third Reich. The war in Europe had ended exactly 8 hours earlier. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was policy. Written policy, handed down from Allied high command in the chaotic final weeks of the European campaign. As German resistance collapsed and millions of civilians, and thousands upon thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers, found themselves suddenly under Allied occupation, the question became urgent. What do you do with a defeated enemy population on the brink of starvation? The answer, drafted in memo after memo stamped War Office 1944, was simple. You feed them. Not out of sentimentality. Not out of charity. Out of cold strategic calculus wrapped in the thinnest veneer of moral principle. A starving population breeds disease. Disease doesn't respect borders. And an angry, desperate population becomes the seed for the next war before the current one is even over. So the policy was clear. Military-age males, POWs surrendered Wehrmacht, would be processed, disarmed, documented, and interned under Geneva Convention protocols. Civilians, especially children, would be fed. Medical care would be provided. Order would be maintained. Security. Diplomacy. Survival. But policy is one thing. Implementation is another. And in the ruins of Wilhelmshaven that May evening, as Canadian occupation forces moved through streets still smoking from the final RAF raids, the distance between a memo and a mess tin was measured in individual choices. Corporal Davies made his. So did Sergeant McLeod, who set up a civilian feeding station in what used to be a schoolhouse. So did Private Chin, a Chinese-Canadian from Vancouver who spent 3 hours that night rigging a field shower so German kids could wash off the grime and lice before they ate. They didn't ask permission. They just did it. By midnight, there were 47 children lined up outside that kitchen. By dawn, over 200. Word spread fast in a ruined city. The Canadians were feeding anyone who asked. Let's step back. Rewind 6 months. Autumn 1944. The Canadian First Army was grinding through the Netherlands, liberating villages and towns in some of the most brutal urban combat of the war. The Dutch welcomed them as heroes. The Germans fought like cornered animals. There was no ambiguity. This was conquest pure and simple. But by spring 1945, the situation had shifted. Germany was collapsing from within. Civilian infrastructure was gone. Food distribution networks had ceased to exist. Millions of refugees, displaced by bombing, by retreating armies, by forced evacuations, were wandering the countryside with nothing. No food. No shelter. No plan. The Allied advance wasn't just a military operation anymore. It was a humanitarian crisis in motion. Canadian units entering northern German cities found scenes that defied easy categorization. Empty streets. White flags hanging from windows. Elderly men and women standing in doorways, hands raised, expecting, what? Execution? Revenge? The propaganda they'd been fed for 12 years told them the Allies were savages. Bolsheviks. Mongols. That surrender meant death. Instead, they got field kitchens and medical tents. The cognitive dissonance was total. Private Ellis, a clerk attached to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, kept a diary. One entry, dated May 10, 1945, reads, "We set up in what used to be a municipal building. Roof half gone, windows blown out, but the walls were solid. First day maybe 10 locals showed up. Mostly old women. Scared out of their minds. Wouldn't look us in the eye. We handed out rations, biscuits, tinned meat, tea. One woman took hers, turned to leave, then stopped. Turned back. Said Danke, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. Then she left. Didn't come back the next day. But her daughter did. That's how it started. Slowly. Tentatively. Trust measured in biscuits and tea. The Canadians weren't naive. They knew who they were feeding. These weren't victims. This was the population that had supported, or at least tolerated, the regime that built Auschwitz. That had cheered the Wehrmacht's victories in Poland and France. That had turned a blind eye while their Jewish neighbors disappeared. But they were also starving. And cold. And terrified. So the Canadians fed them anyway. Not because they deserved it. Because not feeding them would make the Canadians into something they didn't want to become. The boy with the soup tin, let's call him Klaus though that wasn't his real name, came back the next day. And the day after that. Always alone. Always silent. He'd take his ration, eat it slowly, then sit on the same crate and watch the soldiers work. On the 4th day, Davies asked him where his parents were. Klaus looked down. Dead. Bombing. Other family? Gone. Maybe east. I don't know. Where are you staying? Klaus gestured vaguely toward the ruins. There. Davies nodded. Didn't press. That night, he spoke to the company commander, a captain from New Brunswick who'd been a schoolteacher before the war. The captain made some calls. By the next morning, Klaus had a spot in a displaced persons camp run by the Red Cross. Blanket. 3 meals a day. Access to a doctor. Klaus didn't want to go. He wanted to stay near the kitchen. Near Davies. You can visit, Davies told him. But you need to be somewhere with a roof. And a heater. And people who know what to do with kids. Klaus finally agreed. Davies walked him to the camp himself. Before they parted, Klaus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the chocolate bar, the second half still wrapped. He held it out. For you, he said. Davies shook his head. You keep it. But you gave it to me. And now it's yours. You decide what to do with it. Klaus thought about this. Then he unwrapped it, broke off a piece and handed it to Davies. Davies took it. They ate their pieces in silence. Then Klaus turned and walked into the camp. Davies never saw him again. Years later, in an interview for a local paper in Manitoba, Davies was asked why he did it. Why he fed the boy. Why he walked him to the camp. Why he bothered. His answer was blunt. Because he was a kid. And he was hungry. That's it. That's the whole reason. The broader system worked like this. Every Canadian unit entering occupied German territory carried directives regarding civilian populations. These directives were specific, detailed, and surprisingly humane given the circumstances. Immediate needs, food, water, medical care. Priority to children, elderly, and wounded. Public order. Establish martial law. No looting. No reprisals. Violators subject to court-martial. Documentation. Record names, ages, addresses. Track displaced persons. Reunite families when possible. Denazification. Identify and detain party officials, SS, Gestapo. Separate from general population. The last point was crucial. Not every German was a Nazi. Not every Wehrmacht soldier was a war criminal. The Allies understood this, even if public sentiment back home didn't always reflect that nuance. So there was a sorting process. Interrogations. Paperwork. Background checks. The hardcore ideologues were separated out, sent to internment camps for processing and eventual trial. The rest, the rank and file, the conscripts, the civilians who'd kept their heads down, were released into the occupied zones with ration cards and travel permits. It wasn't perfect. Mistakes were made. Some guilty parties slipped through. Some innocent people were caught up in the system. But compared to what could have happened, what had happened in other wars, other conquests, it was a model of restraint. And restraint, in the ruins of 1945 Germany, was a revolutionary act. Sergeant MacLeod ran the feeding station in the old schoolhouse. Before the war, he'd been a social worker in Toronto. He understood systems. He understood people. He understood that hunger doesn't care about ideology. The schoolhouse had been bombed twice. The second floor was gone. The ground floor was intact but for the windows, which were boarded up with salvaged wood and Wehrmacht propaganda posters turned inside out. MacLeod and his team set up long tables, benches made from planks and cinder blocks, and a serving line that operated twice a day, noon and 6 p.m. The first week they served about 300 people a day. By the third week it was over 1,000. The menu was basic. Soup made from powdered stock and whatever vegetables could be scrounged, bread baked in field ovens, tinned meat when available, and tea. Always tea. The British had taught the Canadians well. Tea wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual. Pause. A moment of normalcy in the chaos. MacLeod enforced 2 rules. No cutting in line. No fighting. Violators were banned for a day. It only happened twice. Word spread fast. What surprised MacLeod, what he wrote about in letters home, was how orderly it all was. Germans loved order. Even starving, even defeated, they lined up properly. They waited their turn. They said "danke" when they received their rations. They cleared their own trays. It was surreal. Civilized behavior in the ruins of civilization. One afternoon, an elderly man approached MacLeod after the meal. He was gaunt, bent, missing most of his teeth. He spoke in halting English. "I was teacher," he said. "This school. Mathematics. 30 years. MacLeod nodded. "It's a good building. Solid." "Yes. We built it. 1912. I was young man then." They stood in silence for a moment. "You are not what I expected," the old man said finally. "What did you expect?" The old man hesitated. "Monsters." MacLeod lit a cigarette. Offered one. The old man took it. They smoked together. "We're just soldiers," MacLeod said. "Doing our job." "Your job is to feed us?" "Our job is to not make things worse." The old man nodded slowly. "Thank you." MacLeod shrugged. "Don't thank me. Thank whoever wrote the policy. I'm just the guy with the ladle." But he knew that wasn't true. Policy was paper. He was the one standing there, day after day, ladling soup into bowls, looking into the eyes of people who'd been his enemy a week ago. That was the real work. The hard work. And it mattered. There were moments of tension. Of course there were. A Canadian private named Thompson got into an argument with a German civilian who'd been a Wehrmacht sergeant 2 weeks earlier. The German made a comment about Canadian cowardice, something about waiting until the war was won before showing up. Thompson nearly threw a punch. MacLeod stepped between them. "You want to fight?" MacLeod asked the German. "Go ahead. But you'll lose. And then you'll be hungry again. Your choice." The German backed down. Thompson walked away. Later MacLeod pulled Thompson aside. "I get it," he said. "I do. But that guy's already lost everything. His army, his country, his pride. Beating him up doesn't change anything." Thompson spat. "He doesn't deserve our charity." "Maybe not," MacLeod said. "But we're not giving it because he deserves it. We're giving it because we're better than that." Thompson didn't respond. But he didn't cause any more trouble either. Among the civilians who came to the feeding station was a woman named Frau Brandt. She was perhaps 50, though she looked older. She came every day with her granddaughter, a girl of maybe 8 named Greta. They always sat in the same spot, always ate in silence, always left immediately after. On the 10th day Frau Brandt approached MacLeod. She held out a small object wrapped in cloth. "For you," she said in German. One of the Canadian soldiers translated. MacLeod unwrapped it. It was a pocket watch. Silver. Engraved. "I can't take this," MacLeod said. "Please," Frau Brandt said. "My husband's. He is dead. I have nothing else to give." MacLeod looked at the watch. Then at the woman. Then at the little girl who was watching with wide, serious eyes. He wrapped it back up. Handed it back. "Keep it for your granddaughter. So she remembers him." Frau Brandt's eyes filled with tears. She nodded. Took the watch. Left. The next day she brought MacLeod a drawing. Greta had made it, a crude crayon sketch of soldiers handing out food to children. She'd written Danke at the bottom in unsteady letters. MacLeod pinned it to the wall of the schoolhouse. It stayed there until the Canadians withdrew 6 weeks later. By June, the feeding stations had evolved into something more comprehensive. Medical clinics, schools, work programs. The Canadians weren't just providing emergency relief, they were rebuilding basic infrastructure. German civilians were put to work clearing rubble, repairing roads, restoring water and power lines. They weren't forced. They volunteered. Because it gave them something to do. Because it gave them purpose. Because it was better than sitting in the ruins waiting for something to change. The Canadians paid them in ration vouchers and cigarettes. It wasn't much, but it was something. One crew, led by a former Wehrmacht engineer named Dieter, worked on restoring a collapsed bridge outside the city. The Canadian supervising them was Lieutenant Morrison, a civil engineer from Ontario. Morrison and Dieter worked side by side, sketching plans in the dirt, debating load capacities and support structures. One evening after the work was done, Dieter asked Morrison a question. Why do you trust us? We could sabotage. We could run. We could kill you in your sleep. Morrison considered this. Could you? Dieter shrugged. Probably not. But you don't know that. No, Morrison agreed. But I know this. If I treat you like you're going to sabotage me, you probably will. If I treat you like you're just a guy who knows how to build bridges, maybe you'll act like that instead. Dieter nodded slowly. This is very Canadian. Morrison laughed. Is it? Yes. Naive. But kind. I'll take that, Morrison said. The bridge was finished 2 weeks later. It's still standing today. Not everyone adapted. Not everyone accepted. There were diehards. SS loyalists who refused to surrender, who melted into the civilian population and waited for a chance to strike back. There were Hitler Youth kids who'd been fed propaganda since they could walk, who saw kindness as weakness and cooperation as betrayal. The Canadians dealt with them firmly but without brutality. Arrests, detentions, trials when necessary. But no summary executions. No collective punishment. No reprisals. It wasn't easy. Some Canadian soldiers lost friends in the final weeks of the war, killed by snipers, by booby traps, by fanatics who refused to accept that it was over. The temptation for revenge was real. But the orders were clear. And most of the soldiers followed them. Because the officers understood something crucial. The war was over. What came next would define the peace. And if the peace was built on vengeance and atrocity, then the next war was already brewing. So they fed the children. They treated the wounded. They enforced order without cruelty. They chose restraint. By August, the occupation had settled into a routine. The feeding stations were still operating, but the crisis phase had passed. People weren't starving anymore. Diseases were under control. The schools were reopening. Life, in a fragile and tentative way, was returning. Klaus, the boy from the first day, was thriving at the Red Cross camp. He'd gained weight. Started smiling occasionally. Even made a friend, another displaced kid from Bremen. They were learning English from a Canadian chaplain who'd been a teacher before the war. Frau Brandt's granddaughter, Greta, was attending one of the makeshift schools. She was learning arithmetic and reading and drawing pictures of things that weren't ruins. Dieter, the engineer, was working full-time with the Canadians now, overseeing reconstruction projects across the region. He'd been thoroughly vetted. No party membership, no war crimes, just a soldier who'd done his job and wanted to go home. Except home didn't exist anymore. So he stayed. And he built. These weren't exceptional stories. They were common ones. Repeated across dozens of towns and cities as the occupation forces transitioned from conquerors to administrators to, eventually, something like partners. It wasn't forgiveness. The crimes of the Nazi regime were too vast, too monstrous for that. But it was something else. Something harder to name. Coexistence. Maybe that's the word. September 1945. Corporal Davies received orders to ship out. His unit was being rotated back to Canada for demobilization. He had 3 days to pack up, say his goodbyes, and board the train that would take him to the port. On his last evening in Wilhelmshaven, he walked to the displaced persons camp. As for Klaus, the boy was brought to the gate. They stood on opposite sides of the chain-link fence. Davies held out a package wrapped in brown paper. For you, he said. Klaus took it, unwrapped it. Inside was a knife, a Canadian-issue folding knife, the kind every soldier carried. Also a notebook and 2 pencils. Knives for utility, Davies said. Not for fighting. You use it to open cans, cut rope, that kind of thing. Notebooks for writing. Whatever you want. Thoughts, plans, memories. Klaus looked at the items. Then at Davies. Why? Because you're going to have a life after this, Davies said. And I want you to have tools. Real ones. Klaus nodded. Tried to speak. Couldn't. Davies reached through the fence. Shook the boy's hand. You're going to be all right. Then he turned and walked away. Klaus stood at the fence for a long time, holding the knife and the notebook, watching the Canadian disappear into the evening light. There's a letter in the Canadian War Museum archives. It was written in 1962, addressed to the Department of Veterans Affairs, and forwarded through several channels before it reached its intended recipient. The letter is in English, though the handwriting suggests it's not the author's first language. It reads in part, I am writing to find a Canadian soldier who fed me in May 1945. His name was Davies. He was a cook. I was 14 years old and starving. He gave me soup and chocolate and a blanket. Later he gave me a knife and a notebook. I do not know if he is still alive. I do not know if this letter will reach him. But I wanted him to know that I used the knife for 50 years. I filled the notebook and many others after. I became an engineer. I have a family. I have a good life. Because of him. I wanted him to say thank you. The letter was signed Klaus. The Veterans Affairs Office tried to locate Davies. He'd passed away in 1959 peacefully on his farm outside Winnipeg. His widow confirmed that he'd been in Wilhelmshaven in 1945. She forwarded the letter to his children. One of Davies' sons later said, Dad never talked about the war much. He'd mention the food, the logistics, the routine. But he never mentioned feeding German kids. We had no idea. The knife and the notebook are still out there somewhere. Maybe in a drawer in Germany. Maybe lost. But the story survived. That's the thing about kindness. It echoes. The Canadian occupation of northern Germany lasted until 1946, when administrative control was handed over to the British. By then, the immediate crisis had passed. The population was fed. The infrastructure was functional. The transition from military rule to civil governance was underway. Thousands of Canadian soldiers rotated home. Most of them never spoke about what they'd done. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heroic. It was just feeding people and fixing bridges and making sure the lights came back on. But it mattered. Because the generation of Germans who grew up in those camps and schools and feeding stations, the Klauses and Gretas and hundreds of thousands of others, they remembered. They remembered that the Canadians didn't have to be kind. That they could have been brutal. That they chose otherwise. And maybe, just maybe, that choice helped break the cycle. Epilogue. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of VE Day, a ceremony was held in Wilhelmshaven. Veterans from Canada were invited. A memorial was unveiled, a simple stone plaque commemorating the Canadian occupation and the reconstruction efforts that followed. Among the attendees was an elderly German man. He walked with a cane. He wore a suit. He stood quietly at the back of the crowd while speeches were given and wreaths were laid. When it was over, he approached one of the Canadian veterans. An old man himself now, frail but alert. Were you here? The German man asked. In 1945? Yes, the Canadian said. 3rd Infantry. You. I was a boy. 14. There was a cook. He fed me. The Canadian studied him. I remember the feeding stations. I wasn't a cook though. I was infantry. Security. The German man nodded. You were all part of it. All of you. They stood in silence for a moment. We didn't deserve it, the German man said finally. The Canadian shook his head. Wasn't about deserving. It was about being human. They shook hands. Two old men who'd been on opposite sides of history, meeting in the present, bound by a moment of decency that had rippled across decades. The Canadian veteran died 3 years later. The German man lived until 2003. He never found Corporal Davies. But he never stopped looking. The war had taught them fear. The peace taught them mercy. And in the space between those two lessons, a boy learned that kindness doesn't require justification. That a tin of soup can be an act of resistance against hatred. That the simplest gesture, here eat this, can carry more moral weight than 1,000 speeches. Corporal Davies was right. It wasn't about deserving. It was never about deserving. It was about the choice to remain human when inhumanity would have been easier. That's the legacy. Not the medals or the monuments. Not the speeches or the treaties. Just a cook and a boy and a tin of soup in the ruins of the Reich. And the quiet, stubborn insistence that even in the wreckage of the worst war in human history, Decency still mattered. It still does.